Hello and welcome to our first Infinite Blue Fireside Chat. I'm Frank Shultz, the CEO at Infinite Blue. Thanks for joining us for our new speaker series, Blue Sky Thinking. We started this series because organizations today face more severe and frequent threats than ever before, and they can no longer focus their efforts on preventing physical, cyber, or supply chain disruption. Nor is building a capability to respond swiftly to these events sufficient anymore. Instead, they must think beyond traditional approaches to business continuity and disaster recovery in order to achieve something greater, something that we call total enterprise resilience. But nobody understands this imperative better than our first guest, Jason Veiock. Jason is a security, risk, and resilience leader with one of the most recognizable global technology companies. Before his current role, Jason served as a special agent for the Department of Homeland Security. And in that role, he conducted investigations into national security threats, terrorism, drug smuggling, human trafficking, financial crimes, and commercial fraud. Previous to his work at DHS, he was a special agent for the Diplomatic Security Service with the Department of State. Drawing on his unique background, Jason is today a thought leader on issues ranging from the convergence of physical and cyber threats to building greater levels of readiness and resilience. Jason, I want to welcome you here today.
Thanks for having me.
So I want to start by talking about your experience and the executive branch. So how has that really helped you to prepare for what you're doing today?
I think one of the key takeaways was working at the State Department. From day one as a diplomatic security special agent, they explain to you that you're there to enable foreign diplomacy. And when you realize that you're not the mission, but you're there to enable the mission, it really translates well to the corporate and the private world. So when you get to a corporate security role, you recognize that the outcome isn't security, it isn't resilience, it is about the business. And when you learn what the assets behind the business are, the focus of the business, it puts you in a position to really be successful.
That makes a whole lot of sense. So with a lot of that, when we look at business continuity and disaster recovery today, a lot of organizations are really siloed. So a lot of times, I remember 10, 15 years ago, IT wouldn't talk to the business. And so how can you possibly be aligned? Do you see this concept of siloing, and how do you think, how should we address that?
It's absolutely there, and it's a problem, right? The issue that you run into is when you make the mission about business continuity, when you make the mission about corporate security, then it becomes, let me make sure I have a spreadsheet, let me make sure I have a plan, and you focus on that outcome as opposed to the outcome of being able to enable the business. And in order to know, you have to learn. And when I left the private sector, when I left the government, I realized that the mission is no longer security, the mission's business. And if I don't know the business, I can't protect it, I can't enable it. You have to know the centers of gravity, you have to know the profit centers, you have to know the things that matter the most. You have to be tied in to enterprise risk, you have to be tied in to the business unit leadership, you have to be tied into where people are around the world, what they're trying to achieve, and what the obstacles that they face. Because they're not always these horrible situations, these critical events. Sometimes it's just simple regional things that if you understand what they're trying to achieve and where they are, they can be successful.
So how do you see, you mentioned both the critical events and kind of the day-to-day operations. How do the two of those intersect, and how should we think about that? Because a lot of times in the silo concept, they're run by two different parts of an organization typically, right?
No, absolutely, and I think you think about them as a spectrum, right? I always say that the goal of crisis management is to not have any crises. It's not to be really good at responding to crises, right?
And that's not possible.
Right.
It's not possible to have no crises.
No, it's not, but when you think about the spectrum, right? And that's what organizational resilience is. So if you know what the biggest risks are out there and how they manifest themselves in your environment, you can then worry about, okay, which ones can I prevent? Mm-hmm. And if I can't prevent things from happening, which ones can I at least reduce the impact? And if you reduce the impact, it keeps you out of that crisis realm. And then when you go from, okay, I can't stop it, I can't reduce the impact, then I want to focus on how to speed the time to recovery. And if you can't do all those things with existing playbooks, with existing resources within your own team, that's when a crisis happens. So the crisis has to, really channel all of the efforts of the company, bring all of the pieces together in order to respond to that one incident. But again, the goal is to get out of crisis mode as fast as possible and get back into run the business mode.
That makes complete sense. So, I know if I look at your background, you have experience both in kind of physical, and you've kind of gone into cybersecurity as well. And so like how they're two totally diverse areas of security in an organization in the way that it's traditionally been thought about, right? Like you have almost a security office or a GSOC that operates, and a lot of times you have kind of the cyber team that's off on the side. Like how have you seen them come together, and like how should they work together? Like can they be managed separately?
Well, it's about outcomes. So they could be managed separately, independently, but they have to work together. And really what you think about is there's no such thing as physical or cyber security to the business. Mm-hmm. The business only cares about security, right? The business has assets and they want to protect them, right? They want to make sure that they can do what they're there to do. They want to move as fast as possible. So in the world today where it's very connected, if you start to think about, here are my physical defenses, here are my cyber defenses, where do you think the bad guys operate? They operate right here in the middle.
Yep.
So if you can think about that convergence and you don't think about, I do cybersecurity or I do physical security, I think about, I protect these assets. And threat actors will operate in both domains. And if you don't align that, going back to that spectrum, when we say, if I want to stop something from happening, there's not stopping a physical thing from happening and a cyber thing from happening. They're stopping a thing from happening. And they're leveraging tools in both of those domains. So if you don't at least converge and start to think about how to do that, you're not going to be successful. You're going to give the bad guy that space to operate and exploit.
Do you see them exploit? Do they exploit that today? Will they actually come through and kind of say, "Hey, I can break into a building," and I mean, you see in the movies, right? Like I'll break in and I'll parachute from the ceiling and I'm going to install a USB device that gives everyone the data. I mean, clearly that's not common, but sometimes people are getting physical access that gives them access from a cyber perspective.
No, very much so,
Right.
and I think one of the ways to think about it is maybe social engineering, right? So there's always the ninja dropping out of the ceiling tiles in order to do something, but that is somewhat uncommon.
Yep.
And you have to have really expensive assets, right? Really valuable things that you're protecting for people to go to those means or measures to try to get at them. But social engineering is an opportunity where, okay, I may want to follow like your Facebook account and see where you went to high school. Because guess what your security question is?
That's not my password.
Right.
No.
It's not your password, but it might be your security question when you forget your password.
Yep.
But that's the thing. Things that occur in the physical world. If a threat actor can't go in over the wire, maybe they're going to attack, a particular employee. They're going to exploit a particular vector to then get in. And that could be, the counter intel space, like you see with the government, right? There could be exploiting something in their background in order to get them to become an inside threat. Or it could be just that you're going after them to get their credentials, and then they get in.
Absolutely. Now, it's super interesting because I think there's a lot of things to think about, right? And so, how do you think about prioritizing that for an organization? Like, how do I know? It sounds really bad. I need to worry about everything all at once. Where do I start?
Well, I think about resilience as a connective tissue, something that spreads across the entire company. And a lot of it starts with enterprise risk. You've got a group of people out there that are thinking about what are the biggest problems that could happen to this company, right? And then it comes down to the individual teams. The physical team is going to prioritize what they're doing. The cyber teams are going to prioritize what they're doing. But if you create a forum where they come together and they collaborate, and you really start to say, okay, how do we rack and stack these things at the company level, not at the team level? And what you find is it becomes a Venn diagram.
Because there's
the things that I'm protecting and the cyber team
are
protecting are actually the same thing.
Similar, yep.
Right? And then you can align. And what I've seen too is even within a company, you don't want to have your employees worry about where they have to go. Like, oh, is this a physical problem or a cyber problem? Who do I call? Like one of the examples I always use is you walk out to a parking lot late at night, and your back window's smashed in, and your briefcase is gone, and your laptop was in there, but so maybe it was your passport, right? So was your access badge, and now it's all gone.
Who do I call?
Well, and by the way, you're in a parking lot.
Yep.
Right? It's dark. It's late at night. Somebody just broke into your. Are you at physical risk? So is that a physical problem or a cyber problem?
It's all of them, right?
It's a problem.
It's a problem, exactly. So how do I report that,
It's a
right?
business problem.
Yes.
Right? And what you want to do is give them that single vehicle to go to, not worry about it, right? Take away all of the thinking that's required to go, well, here I have to do that.
Yep.
And that's actually where my convergence journey started. So I was able to take that off of somebody's plate. Why would I, if I'm the first person called as the physical person about that stolen laptop, why would I then take the time to create a ticket for IT to basically log on to an interface, right? Type in a serial number and click a button.
Yep.
Those are things that you don't need a cyber engineer or an information security engineer to do that. And by bringing those little things together, I think is how you be successful. Too many times companies are like, okay, we're going to converge. We're going to take these things and we're going to slam them together.
Yep.
And is that we're going to do it in a room? We're going to do it with a team? Does it need a single boss? No. You take the thing, the response, the incident, right, the input, and you figure out how to align in that response. And then all of a sudden it grows, because then you get two teams that start working together. And you have one success, then you have another success, and it ink blots out. And then it just becomes an organizational culture.
It's really interesting because kind of the concept that you're talking around or talking about here, I think, if almost focuses on who's my customer in resilience, right? Like you're kind of saying your customer is the person in the parking lot, in one way, the person in the parking lot whose car got smashed in and now they need to figure out how to report it. That's a customer to resilience, right? Or a client that's going to be basically say, how do I interact with our program of resilience in a way that helps the company, protects the business? It's a different way of thinking, right? Because we don't really, a lot of times we think about our customers or our clients as external to our company.
Well, and I'll tell you, and this is where I think learning the business is really important. So, in one of the things that I've been able to figure out in the private sector is a theory of the customer and the customer of my customer. Mm-hmm. And if you really acknowledge that and you understand it, and I've read a couple books on it, that's how we run our teams. Okay, so I think about our immediate customer is that person in the parking lot, but ultimately the customer of my customer is the business.
Yes.
Or you could reverse it. Either way. But you have to understand what are the problems and situations facing that person in that critical moment, but then how does that problem or situation actually present a risk to the company? And if you do one, you're only going to be partially successful.
Makes sense. You mentioned books. Any book that you would recommend for people to take a look at?
Sure. Where I learned the C1, C2 concept was called Better, Simpler Strategy. It's put out by a Harvard Business School professor. Okay. So I've learned a ton from that. And I also, short attention span. There's a lot of vignettes in there, which are really helpful. You can read them, get through them, and not have to sit down for 6 hours and plow through a big book.
Probably good to share that training with others too, right? If you can give them a simple snapshot or kind of
Absolutely.
A paradigm.
Well, it talks about how to build value, and that's what I talk about with our team all day long. How do you build value for the business? We'll probably get to a question that talks about cost centers at some point.
Yeah, I mean that's actually a good pivot. If you think about, we're approaching. I laughed. So I read something that said that the recession is always 6 months away, as we're kind of talking about it. But companies are starting to cut. You're seeing some cuts happen in the tech sector, starting to spread out from there. What do you think about organizations when they go to cut, and maybe they start to cut resilience or kind of risk folks? How do we think about that, and how should they think more about protecting their resilience program?
Well, I have a different perspective on that one. Sure. I don't think that the business sits around and says, how do I cut my resilience team? I think what they do is they say, how do I go and save value? So what I tell my team every day is the business will go on without us. So let's demonstrate every single day how we provide value. Mm-hmm. And if we put that in the back of our mind, right, and we think about, what am I doing today? Because it's really easy as a practitioner in an individual space to get sucked into what you do, and have that egocentric view, if you will, right? I'm in the middle. I'm thinking about what I'm doing and how do I do this thing better. Yep. But if you pivot a little bit and you think about how is what I'm doing going to provide value to the business, and a big question that I think people in the space need to ask is what I'm doing today actually providing value to the business. Right? Am I getting good at executing on what I believe a business continuity or a corporate, security or a crisis management program is supposed to do, or am I actually providing value? And if you provide value every day, the cut conversation in normal times shouldn't really rear its head.
That makes sense. I think about the traditional approach to, specifically on like the business continuity disaster recovery side, sometimes I think it was almost seen as I provide value because I create a plan and I test it. Is that value? I guess it's better than doing nothing, but how can we make that more valuable if you think of it that way?
I joke around and I say that my job now, as I've kind of risen up the chain, if you will, is to be the security marketer in charge. Mm-hmm. And I talk about, if what I'm saying I can hear back, from an executive or from a business unit leader, then we're doing the right thing. But what it really boils down to is engagement. So if I think that me building that plan and executing or training that plan twice a year, but I'm never hearing the business reverberate it back to me. I'm not seeing them adopt those practices in their day-to-day. All right, resilience isn't about having done a BIA or having a plan on a shelf. Resilience is about when the HR team is faced with the crisis, can they respond appropriately? And if you infuse that team with the ability to respond, then you never need your crisis plan. You never need your business continuity plan. And so that's where, I think the focus really becomes, if you get the level of engagement and you see the adoption of the principles, right, of the things that you're talking about, that's how you build the culture.
It's really interesting because I think you've shifted, in your mind, the focus is on enabling the people to be able to do what they need to do. A lot of times you hear the focus is testing or validating the plan, right? Like it's a nuanced difference, right? But you're saying the exercise is to make sure that people are ready, not to make sure the plan, all the steps are sequenced properly. It could be both.
It could be, but if you focus on the plan, you're not focusing on the value, right? You could go through an exercise and say, we took this plan off the shelf, it's got 47 steps, we did all 47 steps, they worked great. Okay, did you solve the problem? Well, no, we didn't solve the problem, but we did all 47 steps and the plan worked according to the way it should. But if you don't think about why are we doing this plan? Why is this here? And go back to that spectrum. Is it, stopping the thing from happening, lessening the impact, speeding the time to recovery, getting out of crisis mode back to run the business? Those are the KPIs that I think you just constantly evaluate against.
No, it makes a whole lot of sense. Now, if you think back to really like the huge surge and focus on business continuity and resilience really came after 9/11. So, you think something very major, dramatic happened, and we said, okay, we have to be better prepared. We have to think about this differently, both from a government level and a private business level. If I take kind of where we're at today and we take a look back and also a look forward, where are we going to be in 2030 on the other side of that as we've evolved from that kind of major event in the United States to 8 years from now or 10 years from now?
I think it depends. These things tend to be cyclical. In my State Department time, you could always tie budget to, attack. So the thing happens, you get the budget, and then the thing doesn't happen for a while, the budget goes down, and then the thing happens again. And I think trying to maintain that steady state is where you want to be. But the cyclical nature of it is problematic. And I think the other thing too is, I would even make the argument at least in the space that I've been exposed to, COVID was a bigger wake up than 9/11 in the private sector. And I can't attribute this, so I don't remember the right person's name, but have you heard the Black Swan, Gray Rhino conversation? Right, so the Black Swan event is the 9/11. Nobody saw it coming, right? Terrorism, yeah, that's a thing, but the scope, the scale, the magnitude of how it happened, right? That wasn't really anticipated.
Correct.
But the Gray Rhino is the thing that we should have known about. We see it, it's running right at us. And pandemics. How many pandemic plans did you see on a shelf pre-COVID? And how many were executed successfully?
How many were not updated for 15 years? Right?
Or not utilized.
We thought about it differently, or the vendor strategy was, oh, well, there's a regional incident, I'll just go to a vendor somewhere else, right? Or I'll go to my staff in another country.
Well, and until you actually have the event, you can't really validate. I'll tell I don't know if this is a good story or not, but I'll tell it anyway. I was an EMT and a firefighter growing up, and when I was first trained in the late 90s, you never put a tourniquet on, right? You didn't put a tourniquet on unless the person was going to lose a limb. And it was like a last resort, and if you did, you had to take the time, and you had to hope that we would save the leg or save the arm. You fast forward after 20 years in combat in Iraq and Afghanistan, and that's a primary means of hemorrhage control now. So the thing that we thought prior to the shooting war wasn't really the thing that we needed. And once it was validated and tested in an operational environment, then you can come back and say, ooh, that plan wasn't so good. Here's what we really needed. And hopefully, people are learning from that. Those pandemic plans hopefully are evolving into what we're going to deal with next. Because I don't think that one's going away.
Yeah, I think the focus you have and highlighting it, I think is really critical to incorporate that learning aspect into your resilience program, right? So it's not just, and I think it really comes from a focus on not just incorporating critical events like we talked about before, but kind of everyday events. And so there's a lot of learning to happen. Like if I go do something and the outcome isn't the way I want it to be, I'm not going to do the same thing again, right? Like there's a learned effort as a result of that. Sometimes, the programs don't shift as quickly as they need to because they're big and they're lumbering and it's hard to steer that around versus kind of saying, hey, we just need little bite-sized pieces of learning here, right, that we're going to incorporate back in.
Well, no, and I think that's where data is critical, right? It's not even learning as much as I go back to that marketing story. You know, the simplest things can be communicated with good data. In fact, you don't even have to draw the inferences to your audience with really good data. So if you capture probability, you capture impact, you keep real metrics of how often these things occur, and then you say, geez, why are we doing this thing when this thing happens every single day? If we took this and we adjusted it to a different plan, I'll give you like a really basic example. You think about like guard deployments in a building, right? At one point we had guard deployments in multiple buildings. It was the same thing. And then we started looking at medical response data. And we have a ton of medical responses in this building. We should probably transition an additional guard over here so that we can respond to these things. Do we want to think about maybe that security officer having medical training? And that's a really tactical, example, but it's one that I think bears throughout the entire, like it scales. You know,
you're evolving, you're learning, you're evolving, and you're saying, hey, here's how we can be better.
But at the major incident level, it works too, right? You just have to have good data. You have to be able to present it in a way that you can infer the outcomes, and then you get to that point where people are willing to do it.
Makes sense. Makes sense. If you think about the threat landscape today and kind of coming over the next maybe, let's say, 18 or 24 months, what are the biggest threats that I think companies that you think companies should be concerned with? Where should we focus our attention right now? I know it's
everywhere.
It's a big question, right?
Right. Yeah. I actually had this thought the other day. Is companies are regularly dealing with breaches, and you think about cyber insurance and the conversation about maybe there won't be these cyber insurance policies moving forward.
They've been more difficult to get, right? More expensive, more difficult to get.
Well, but when's the mindset shift, right? So I go back and think about it, and I'm not the smartest person in the world, so I try to draw analogies wherever I go. And everybody's got a house.
Yep.
Houses still get broken into, right? We've had houses ad infinitum throughout civilization, but they still get broken into. So if we understand that that's going to happen, right? What do we do to operate within that space? We still have police that respond, right? We still have CSI that comes out and dusts for prints and tries to figure it out. But I think if we operate in that environment and we start to say, like, these are going to happen, how do we stop the ones that we can absolutely stop? How do we reduce the impact? How do we build that into what we do? I think that opens up the bandwidth for some of the other areas outside of cyber. But even as a core physical corporate security guy, I'm one to say that cyber is the biggest risk out there, right? It's easy for the threat actor, to do it, especially if we're not doing our job at the basics.
Makes sense. Think about looking at anything beside. How about physical security? Any key concerns? Weather, anything that's top of your list, or would you say cyber kind of is the key focus and the kind of the convergence of cyber enabling the business?
Well, no, I think that, so COVID's a big outcome here, right? I mean, it's hybrid workforce is a real thing. If you think about business continuity or physical security in the physical space, it was, well, I'm going to build a building. If that building is, subject to severe weather, maybe I have a generator. But now I don't have that building full of people with that generator.
They're all at home.
They're all at home.
Yep.
But what if they're customer engaging employees? Like a severe weather that results in a power internet outage, and now they can't do their job. And that's where it gets really interesting. What's the corporate responsibility, the duty of care to that home office? And do you do things like just geographically disperse your employees? So then you don't have concentrations. And does that work? But do you have awareness of where those employees are? Do you have awareness of where those events are? Can you quickly get to that data and report it back throughout the business so that they can make decisions to, shift calls to a different region, to work on, to, let customers know, whatever the case may be. I think the hybrid workforce, we're still not sure.
Yeah. Especially if I tell you I'm working out of Philadelphia and then I'm like, oh no, I actually went down to Florida for a month. But I didn't tell you, right?
Well, and that's not even that's just a simple business issue, right? Because it's not just working out of Florida. It could be working out of Ireland.
Well, you think, outside of a different country where we may have data residency issues in that regard, or a whole
compliance issues.
Compliance issues, yeah.
I mean, what if, there's opportunities where people may be working from countries where they're not supposed to work in. Where from a cyber perspective, we wouldn't want them to work in. Then something happens to them in a physical space, and they expect their insurance, their health insurance, to kick in, and there's no coverage. Right? Those are real challenges that I think companies are facing today, and the scope's not fully known yet.
No, it makes sense. I think a lot of what you talked about too. I think there's a concept. I feel like we've been trying to build bigger walls for like the last 20 years. And now we're trying to build quicker responses and maybe not bigger walls. I mean, do you agree with that? Like, how do we think about that? Like, how do you make it difficult for kind of threat actors to get through the gate? And then what's the balance of response versus making it difficult?
So I'll come back to the original question, right, which talked about the executive branch and, in the State Department. And one thing that I learned there is that you put your protections against the threat. So to your point about bigger walls, a bigger wall in Afghanistan is different than a bigger wall in a high crime country, right? Because the threat's different. Am I worried about a car bomb, or am I worried about somebody climbing over the wall? Now you start to think about, you have to get to that next level, right? And that's the intersection, I think, of risk and threat. Risk are the centers of gravity, the things, the very broad scope. Threats are how they manifest in your environment, right? That's where you get to exposure. And you start to think about, okay, I'm operating in this location or that location, and this is happening or that's happening, or I've seen this many incidents, right? I have this many employees, I have this type of facility. You get down to that level, I think that's where it comes in.
Makes sense. Now, one probably, question I wanted to ask you too, if somebody came to you and said, hey Jason, like, where do I get started? Like, I'm a resilience professional as well. Where do I get started, or what do I focus on? Because I don't know where to start. What advice might you give them?
I don't know. No, it's funny. I have a mentor, and I remember back in the day, I was not going to be an accountant. I was not going to be a doctor. And I didn't, you're that 18-year-old kid, you're going to college, maybe not the best. I did much better in graduate school than I did in high school or undergrad. But, this mentor told me, if you don't know what you're going to do, go get a broad-based liberal arts education. Learn how to think. I think if I look back on my experiences, the things that have provided value, I alluded to the fact that I was a firefighter and EMT at a young age. Right? I was actually, I think, the youngest EMT in the state of New Jersey.
Oh, wow.
I turned 16 and I got certified. But what I didn't realize was I learned how to be a firefighter. And I don't mean like putting out a fire. I mean learning how to be calm, learning how to react to the crisis, to work the problem. Old Jason was not thinking that experience was going to be really beneficial 40 years down the road. I just thought it was fun to ride on a fire truck, and it was an adrenaline junkie. But same thing. When I was in the military, I worked in operations centers, and I learned how to do. If there's a common theme in my background, it was actually about operations. Subject matter expertise might be security based on what I've done, but really the underpinning is operations. Right? I did operations. Even in that first span, but, in the military, I was in space operations. I ran space operations centers.
That's cool.
It's not as cool as it sounds. Okay. I'm not going to lie to you. But it was really beneficial from a career perspective. Even with the State Department, had the opportunity to run an operations center at our embassy overseas. And you start to learn how to fuse all that data. But it's the same process. What are the threats? How can we stop them from happening? How can we, reduce the impact, speed the time to recovery or response, whatever, right? Sometimes it's speed the time of detection, speed the time of recovery, speed the time, all of those metrics are critical. But yeah, I think that, I think a broad background is important. Not to be a recruiter here, but my military experience was really beneficial.
Absolutely.
And I think, I've got 2 kids, and I've told them that I would encourage them to do it. Because you learn something that a lot of the population doesn't learn, and it translated. I've been very lucky. I joke and say that every job I've had I thought was going to be a career, and I ended up leaving after 5 or 7 years. I was in the Air Force for 5 years, the State Department for 8, Homeland Security for 5 more, and every time I took that job, I was like, I'm going to retire from that. Right? I'll be a 50-year-old retired DS agent and never quite made it. But I think that varied experience is helpful. But be a continuous learner. If you want to think about where I'm successful, where I think I'm successful today, it's because I showed up, didn't know anything about the business that the company that I work for operates in, but I took a lot of time to learn it. And you listen, and if you learn that business, then you can be successful.
Do you move on when you stop learning? What's the key for you? Learn something new?
Well, I've been very lucky.
You're always learning from what I can
Well,
tell.
and I've got a kind of a varied background, right? Since I've been in the private sector, I've had the ability to do physical security. I actually did physical and cyber converged security at one point. I did some real estate and workplace services at one point. We took on health and safety post-COVID, which was a new thing. Maybe I move on when I stop learning, but I've been kept actively engaged so far, and I think there's always something new to learn. And especially in an evolving business, M&A is a great way to learn. You're taking on a new location, a new business unit, a new stream, a new something, and it'll keep the fire stoked.
Keep you going. Awesome. Jason, I want to thank you for joining us today. It's been really great catching up with you and having the conversation and learning about resilience. I'm sure we're going to continue to learn about this as we go forward.
No, appreciate it. Good times.
So awesome. Thank you. I want to thank everybody who joined us as well. We're going to send a survey out. We'd love to hear what you think about the program and the chat today, and anything that you'd like to see in future conversations that we have. We hope you enjoyed it, and we hope to see you on the next Infinite Blue Sky Thinking. Thank you.